Hi, my name is Sarah Abramson. I am a sophomore Africana Studies major. I have the incredible honor of welcoming up the faculty panel for today, being chaired by Professor Mapayan. And while the members of the panel make their way up to the chairs, I just want to read from the back of the brochure and talk about just a few of the some of the few of the amazing remarks from faculty both at Wellesley College and from other schools for Professor Steady, because truly she is an institution here and we all love her. Thank you for saying this announcement of Professor Steady's retirement. She was director of the Women's Studies at Sacramento State University for 2 years. Though she was with us for a short period of time, she has had a lasting impact on this campus. Hers has been an exceptional life of scholarship, womanism, and contribution to the well-being of humanity. We are proud and grateful for having had the privilege of knowing her. We hope her retirement proves as fulfilling as her life has been to this point, and we are sure it will be. That was from David Coven, the Emeritus Professor of Pan-Africana Studies and Political Science at Sacramento State University in California. And the final remark reads, "Dear illustrious Sister Filomina, I received the first email/flyer about this major event on April 10th, 2019, when I had just returned from a trip to Kenya and preparing to go to San Francisco for another conference. If I had known, I would have joined to celebrate you and your remarkable and inspiring career. I had already finalized my annual trip to the UN in New York City with Cornell students. Since it is the end of the academic year, we do not have the possibility of postponing it. Otherwise, I would do so that I could join you. I'm quite sure it will be a more memorable day of reflection and debate. Congratulations." And that was Professor Lumumba from the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University.
A panel of eminent faculty members from different institutions have been given the opportunity to further elaborate on the legacy of Filomina Steady and her work. And so, without much further ado, I'm going to briefly introduce each person. The extended biographies for each person are in the program book, and I encourage you to read them because there's so much good information there. But I want to begin by introducing to my right Professor Stanley James, who is currently Vice Provost and Professor at Arizona State University. And then to her left is Professor Oyeronke Oyewumi, Professor of Sociology at Stony Brook University. To her left is Professor Asoka Bandarage, who is a visiting professor at Colorado College and Georgetown University, followed by our own Professor Ludwin Kaptins, Professor of History at Wellesley College, and then our discussant, Daphne Intiri, of African American Studies at Wayne State University. Dr. Intiri will be our discussant at the end of the presentation.
Some of you might not know this, but for probably about 20 years, I've been working on a book about the contributions of Black women to international human rights. And I've interviewed wonderful people, and it's been an exciting process. And one of the people, of course, that I had to interview was Filomina Steady. So I thought, let me tell you a little bit about Filomina in a different kind of way. Filomina and I went on a trip to Durban, South Africa, to the UN World Conference on Race. That's the short term for it, the WCAR conference in 2001. And for some reason, and you've heard about it earlier, Filomina had registered one of her NGOs in Geneva, Switzerland. So when we got in Durban, they gave us our credentials as members of her NGO. And it said that we were representatives from Switzerland. So here we are, two Black women wandering around South Africa, Filomina with her soft, precise Sierra Leonean accent, me with my Midwestern flat American accent. We got a lot of perplexed looks, you know. Meanwhile, Filomena noticed that her home country was not represented at the official UN governmental conference. So since she was there, she just decided she'd call up the government. She contacted the government in Sierra Leone and offered to represent them. I was actually kind of stunned to think that one could just call up their government and offer their services for such a task, and then be given the necessary credentials and the clearance so effortlessly. I'm pretty sure that had I called up the U.S. government, they would not have been so receptive to me making such an offer, and I probably would have been detained and examined to determine if I was suffering from some sort of mental defect. Anyway, so that's one of our stories. So I was thinking that you probably wanted to know or me to talk about what she does or what she has done in the UN, although most of you have already done that. But I'm still going to talk about it anyway because that's what I came prepared to do. At any rate, you know that she was educated in Sierra Leone, and then she was making a choice about whether to go to the UK for her undergraduate education or come to the US. And she tells me that she was a little worried about coming to the US because as far as she knew, it was full of criminals and and also cowboys. She said that. I have it on tape. But anyway, she made up her mind and she came to the US to pursue her degree. And I think you married Henry here. Did you? Or, yes, she met Henry, and she married him. She came to the U.S. to find her Sierra Leone husband, and but then they went on to St. Anne's College in Oxford, and she did her field work in Sierra Leone, and then she and Henry returned to Boston so that he could do his medical residency. While she was here, she taught in a number of different places, and she taught a wide range of courses, including medical anthropology, which I'll get back to in a minute. But she taught at places like Yale University, Boston University, and Wesleyan College. And that's not all. Those are just a few of them. Now, you may remember that in 1972, the UN General Assembly voted to proclaim 1975 the International Women's Year, IWY, as a part of the second United Nations Development Decade. The purpose of the IWY was, quote, the encouragement of the full integration of women in the total development effort. So to that end, the Commission on the Status of Women was asked to develop a program for that year. So this was Filomena's first encounter with the UN in 1975 when she attended the IWY in Mexico City. After that historic conference, the UN went on to declare 1976 to 1985 the decade for women. They do that. I don't know why they don't do the 1975 to 85, but that's how they do it. Anyway, the mid-decade conference was held in Copenhagen in 1980, followed by the end of the decade conference in Nairobi in 1985. In 1977, the Association of African Women for Research and Development, AWARD, was established in Dakar, Senegal, with Filomena as one of its founding members. Although she had participated in the 75 UN World Conference of the International Year of the Woman, it was somewhere around 1979 when Filomena, through her connections to AWARD, began to seriously work with the UN. Over the years, she developed a very versatile record of participation in UN activities. So from 1979 to 80, she was a consultant to the Secretariat working on the UN World Conference on Women in Copenhagen in 1980, while at the same time she was also a professor at Wesleyan University in Middleton, Connecticut. From 1984 to 86, she served as director of the Branch for the Advancement of Women, which was mentioned earlier, which would later become known as the Division for the Advancement of Women in Vienna, Austria. They were responsible for preparing the third UN World Conference on Women in Nairobi, Kenya. For that conference, she served as a member of the executive committee that collected the data, prepared the documentation, organized the preparatory conferences, often called PrepComs, and consulted with various governments, NGOs, and policy analysts. As a director, she helped to supervise the team that developed the draft of the Nairobi forward-looking strategies based on their research and policy analysis. They developed the recommendations and the options for governmental consideration at the PrepComs and then at the conference itself. Filomina's UN endeavors have been grounded in her staunch belief that women's rights are and should be deeply embedded in ever more comprehensive human rights. And as such, she characterizes her work as multidimensional. In her third assignment at the UN, she became special advisor to Maurice Strong, Secretary General of the UN Conference on Environment and Development. This is the one that was dubbed the Earth Science in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. From 1990 to 1993, she lived and worked at its secretariat, which was based in Geneva, Switzerland. She was a special advisor on women, environment, and development, and her task was to mainstream gender issues in all areas of the work on the Earth Summit, particularly as it pertained to documentation. This meant that she engaged in research, gender analysis, policy analysis, and the development of gender-sensitive policies. Not only was this very critical work in and of itself, but it was also groundbreaking work in another very important sense. This was the first general conference sponsored by the UN to mainstream gender issues in an extensive way. She recalled that prior to this World Conference, women's issues were dealt with only at conferences on women and at population conferences. The pioneering aspect of this conference was evident in the plan of action adopted by the Earth Summit called Agenda 21, which included a chapter on women as part of the section on the role of major groups in environment and development. Filomina stated that, quote, "A pattern of action was established that encouraged conferences to mainstream women's agenda and gender issues. Because of the 1992 Earth Summit experience, all major conferences since that were not specifically on women have followed suit and mainstream gender issues," unquote. She insists that the emphasis on the phrase "women's rights are human rights" that was prevalent at the 1994 Vienna Conference on Human Rights developed out of this work on the Earth Summit. She went on to argue that what she called the rights approach is based on the premise that however we came to be in unequal situations, women are entitled to certain opportunities, benefits, and rewards. And in inimical Filomina Steady way, she said, because it's their right. So one should not waste time arguing anymore. One should simply say that women have a right to equality, development, and peace, unquote. She would go on to work with the 1995 UN on the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing. During that time period and afterwards, she served as a special advisor to the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, and was based in Vienna, Austria from 1994 to 95. After UNIDO, she continued to work with the UN through short-term consultations with UN organizations working on programs, field missions, and advisory boards, or helping with some aspect of the implementation of plans of actions and programs. Although she had participated in an increasing degree in the UN and their world conferences on women, especially, it was in the preparation for the Copenhagen conference when she became more fully immersed in international human rights work. The UN Secretariat for the Copenhagen conference was seeking someone from AWORD, we talked about that a minute ago, to become involved in the preparation of documents for the PrepComs and for the conference itself. They were especially seeking someone to work on a woman and health document who could focus on the social and cultural dimensions of health. At that time, she happened to be teaching medical anthropology at Wesleyan University, so AWORD felt that she was the best candidate to recommend for the consultancy. The team included other people like medical doctors, but they were specifically interested in including an anthropologist on the team. So some of you who have studied the UN Decade for Women remember that there were 3 themes: equality, development, and peace. But there were also 3 sub-themes under development that it included: education, employment, and health. And this is where she came in. Let's see, I'm trying to cut it out. Okay. She went to work to develop the questionnaires that were sent to governments requesting information on women's health in their respective countries. They asked questions like, what were the problems? What were the obstacles? And what were their plans to do something about that? What was women's roles in the health area? She recalled that, quote, certain areas featured predominantly, such as the basic health statistics of life expectancy, infant mortality, and morbidity, and questions such as what diseases were most prevalent in women. And then governments had to answer questions about health services, including what are the services available to women? How accessible are they? How affordable are they? How are women themselves participating in the delivery of health care as doctors, nurses, and so on? Although these were the main questions, Filomina also felt that from a psychological perspective, they needed to look more carefully at issues of nutrition, women's workload, and its impact on their health. And it was at this point that violence against women was introduced as a health issue. And this is critical, absolutely critical in her work. Although the Secretary General of the conference and the Secretariat fully appreciated this new focus on violence as a health issue, Filomina had to present this work to a team of people from other UN agencies, including the World Health Organization. As she recalled, the WHO representative at the meeting, quote, was not at all disposed towards all the social indicators I was examining that she thought had nothing to do with health, unquote. She remembered arguing with the WHO representative and finally in exasperation saying, well, are you trying to tell me that violence is only a health issue when a woman collapses in the hospital emergency room? The problem starts long before that, unquote. Fortunately, with the full support of the Secretariat, she finally won the support of the WHO for the document. And in fact, the document that WHO prepared for the conference also included information on violence. How much time do I have? Is that it? Oh, good. Okay. Filomina is justifiably proud of her critical role in bringing the movement of violence against women as a health issue to global attention. Although there was already a legal point of view on this subject, this was the first time that a link had been drawn between women's health and violence against women. According to Filomina, a health perspective on this subject served to make it more urgent, and people began to take it more seriously because it moved beyond the law. It recognized that people get sick, that they could be maimed, and in fact could even die before the law actually stepped in. The issue of violence then was moving towards becoming a central issue in human rights. The UN response was to prepare a declaration on violence against women in 1979 and to appoint a special rapporteur on violence against women in the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, Switzerland. Filomina was also deeply involved in developing the Secretariat draft of the Nairobi Forward-Looking Strategy, where the subject of violence was included in the areas of special concern. But by the 1995 Beijing conference, the issue of violence against women had evolved sufficiently to merit a chapter of its own in the final document. Okay, good.
Oh, Oyeronke Oyewumi from Stony Brook University. It's an honor to be here and to see you all, and most importantly, to see Professor Steady. I don't even know where to start, but the title of my presentation, I keep looking for the program because I've forgotten now. I'm always playing with words, so I don't know which word, but yes, the title of the presentation is Motherhood as the Practice of Leadership, Appreciating Filomina Steady's Research Insights on the Pioneers Called African Women. And Professor Steady herself is a pioneer. If we have time later, I can explain my motherhood as a practice of leadership. But I see here that I actually have another wonderful subtitle, and it seems as if Ms. Dr. Fitzpatrick was reading my mind, because the title here I have is The Steady Hand. Okay? We're all on the same page here. She inspires us to great things. Okay? Well, let me start by saying that the dependency and dependency syndrome that characterizes Africa's political economy also manifests in research and writing on Africa. Steady always broke away from that pattern, displaying an authentic African voice and seeking to bring more African voices, even from the grassroots, to the table, and seeking to understand Africa on its own terms. Professor Steady has been decolonizing before it became fashionable. And when I say decolonizing, I always want to explain further, what does decolonizing mean? It means indigenizing, it means endogenizing, it means being Afrocentric. For those of us from Africa, it means historicizing, it means thinking from within, what Professor Steady calls the emic perspective. From that, I know she's an anthropologist. To decolonize is to localize, to endogenize, to indigenize, to historicize, to unlearn white supremacy, to recover, to put ourselves at the center of our own knowledge production. And I think that's what Professor Steady does, and that's what we've learned from her. Let me just run through what I call the elements of the steady hand. Number one, and it's in no particular order, emphasis on methodology, not theorizing theory from the armchair, as Professor Nebeka said, Because people are always theorizing theory. They've never been to Africa. They've been there. They're not talking to people. People are theorizing theory. So her emphasis on methodology is so important. And you see it when she talks about field work. And what that led to is listening to African women, listening to your subject, and thus able to discover the importance of motherhood for African women at a point where people think motherhood is a 4-letter word. But when you talk to your subjects, you know what to do. And her emphasis on methodology is particularly important to me because when I was in graduate school, and many of us Africans, we come to graduate school, and we go to graduate school in lonely places where there's no Africa. Although I went to Berkeley, and Berkeley had all its good points. But I was there in my department. They'd never heard of Africa, whatever. Anyway, so it was always important. It was always important to have the work of people like Professor Steady, especially on that all-important thing about methodology, because you're scratching your head, how do I bring Africa here where nobody has a sense of it? So her work was a roadmap in more ways than one, and I really appreciated that. Number 2, she has a keen understanding and emphasis on political economy of globalization and its continuing impact on Africana females especially. She takes the global dimension seriously, and I cannot say that enough. We cannot be theorizing Africa in isolation, given the history of colonization, of globalization, of the place in which we find ourselves. So there's a lot students can learn, that we all can learn from this, her work on globalization. Then she also has this, what I call a great sense of the expansive and extensive nature of her subjects. African diaspora, global Africa. Perhaps that is a testament to her biography as a Creole woman of a culture of many parts. I just read that book. We'll talk about it. Culture of many parts. Then, of course, she has a sense of history. We must have a sense of history, especially since we're Africans, African women. That's where everything started. That's where everything started. And these days, I emphasize this idea that we must have a sense of history because I don't think we as Africans or anybody in the world has appreciated enough that humanity is the gift of an African mother. Humanity started in Africa. And then I read further that Homo sapiens sapiens has been in existence for 200,000 years. And they only left Africa 50,000 years ago. What happened to that 150,000 years? What sense do we make of it? Why doesn't it count? What can we learn if we start thinking from that location? We must have a sense of history. And this sense of history that Professor Steady has was brought home to me because this morning I finally listened to her lecture on leadership on the conference last year. And I was pleasantly surprised that she had unearthed this historical fact that it was the liberated women of Sierra Leone who were the pioneers of female voting in the world. I had never heard that. I only knew that this morning from that work. Think about the implications of it. Everybody bringing religions and voting and politics and parliaments to Africa. That's where everything started. We don't need people to bring stuff. Okay? Especially since a lot of it is bad stuff. When they have good stuff, they don't bring it. So she also has a sense of history. But most importantly now, another aspect, and this is the point at which the one I will really zero in on, her work on motherhood. and the importance of motherhood. And I think that all comes from listening to her subject, paying attention. And she started writing on motherhood. Even in the book, Black Women Cross-Culturally, I remember quoting her on what she calls Africa being the home of original feminism. And where she had talked about motherhood is about agency, it's about doing, and all that. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is to talk about the importance of motherhood for activism, for leadership, for theorizing, which she has done very well. I'll just be repeating some of what she's done, but I'm also going to link it up with my own work and the work of other people. And then this morning, I discovered that I really didn't even have to write this anew. This is straight from my book. I had been quoting her. So let me just read some of that part. I've been very critical of the way in which we theorize theory and the way in which a lot of writing, even by African women who do work on gender, is so dependent on the West. Maybe because of what they call donor-driven research, who funds you and all that, you know? So it was always clear to me, and this is what I wrote, it is in the arena of grassroots activism that African construction of motherhood are revealed in their variety. Studies on African women and leadership have exposed strong connections between motherhood and leadership. Filomina Steady, easily the foremost scholar on African women and leadership, in her recent study of African women in 4 West African countries, and in the book Women and Leadership in Africa, Mothering the Nation, Humanizing the State, says that motherhood retains a positive connection with leadership because Africans understand that the fundamental role of mothers goes beyond reproductive and nurturing roles in households, but reflects the normative values and humanistic ideologies. End of quote. In my own research on motherhood, I found that mother is the name many African women choose to call themselves. They revel in the role identity, and it is often an impetus to activism. A central theme in much discussion of motherhood is that it is inherently the practice of leadership. As leaders, mothers are also visionaries, as they must constantly project into the future for the benefit of their children. And one way in which I think about mothers as visionaries is that you put breakfast on the table and you are always, gee, what are we going to have for lunch? That is vision. That is vision. So mothers are visionaries, and that's part of my way of thinking as motherhood as the practice of leadership. Okay. The ideology of motherhood extends to all mothers and constituted the basis for compelling obedience from everyone who gestated in the womb. Its power covers a range of activities that continues long after the birth of the child, the most important of which is establishing the moral parameters of belongingness and loyalty. We can see the basis of the maternal ideology in the stories of origin and creation in a number of African societies. When you look at African stories of creation, they always start from the maternal, it's the mother. And even the paleontologists, the science, agrees with the African, not the Adam and Eve stuff. That is something else, okay? And so when we talk about the dyad, people, in the West, people are so taken up with the couple, man and woman, male and female, husband. In many societies, when you start thinking from the ground up, the dyad is the mother and child. Even the king and husbands are our children. So mother is supreme. As Igbo people will say, Nneka. Mother is supreme. There's no counterpart. The reason why in my latest book I called it What Gender is Motherhood is the whole idea that mother is at the apex. Father is not its counterpart. In many of our cultures, there's no counterpart. Everybody else are her children. And I see parallels, a parallel in my understanding of gender, what gender is motherhood, in Professor Steady's concept of sociocentric, that the way in which mothers operate is sociocentric. That's why matriarchy and patriarchy are not counterparts. Patriarchy is exclusive, privileges men. Matriarchy is sociocentric because it includes everybody. Mothers looking out for humanity. What do I have now? 2 minutes? Okay, I'll go to my 2 minutes now, and I want to conclude on a more personal note. I said the personal is political and intellectual. I have been a beneficiary of the steady hand, both literally and metaphorically. I believe I met Professor Steady. The first time I met her was at the Nairobi conference in 1985. I had just started graduate school. She has supported me with counsel, good advice through the rough roads, words of encouragement, and yes, she has written copious letters of recommendation for me, and I am grateful for that. Your academic children, like Oliver Twist, want more. And I know that you enjoy your work so much, and we're glad you do, because we've benefited so much from it as Africans, as global people, and I look forward to that you're writing more. But I'm going to make a very specific request. Could you please write your memoir? Oh. May you live long, may you continue to churn out these wonderful things, and may we continue to be part of each other and support each other. Ashe.
It is, of course, impossible to do justice to Professor Filomina Steady's life's work in the context of these short remarks. And also, I'm going to skip some of them because some aspects of her curriculum vitae have been now mentioned several times, and it allows me to build in a story a little later on. So I'm going to skip the education and all the wonderful places where she studied and taught. And I'm going to start when I came to Wellesley, and I saw Professor Steady's courses and the range of courses that she taught. I was stunned because they cover so many different areas. And here I'm a historian. I do women's history, constructions of gender, but she also does, of course, medical anthropology, environment, South Africa, diaspora, but also really different thematic fields, right? So, but once one understands how Professor Steady conceptualizes humanist feminism, as it has been developed and practiced, especially in African context, then her teaching fields, her publications, and her practical leadership roles all form a complex but organic whole. For the foundation of all of these areas of excellent achievement is her insight that women's advancement must be human advancement and cannot but imply confronting and overcoming as a connected whole sexism, racism, and the structured expendability inherent in neocolonial and neoliberal political and economic domination, ecological exploitation and underdevelopment, and other forms of essentializing forms of discrimination, such as in global approaches to illness and health. And so she really, once you theorize these different forms of exploitation as a connected whole, then you are in environment, then you are in health, then you are in all these different fields that she has taught. This conceptualization of humanistic feminist and progressive social change underlies the impressive breadth and depth of her teaching fields, all centered on Africa and the African diaspora, which include theory and methodology. And I'm also old enough to remember that that field was not open to women, or even more so to Black women and African women. So the depth of her teaching field, all centered on Africa and the African diaspora, which include theory and methodology, women's and gender studies, Black women cross-culturally, medical anthropology, urban development, and environmental justice. It has also informed her praxis. Professor Steady did fieldwork in at least 7 African countries: Ghana, Kenya, Mozambique, Senegal, Sierra Leone, South Africa, and Tanzania. She was a founding member and directed at least 3 NGOs, including the already mentioned, but can never be mentioned enough, groundbreaking Association of African Women for Research and Development, AWARD, of which she was the co-founder. Already we heard about the many decades that she provided leadership at STUN, so I will not go in further detail. I really cannot do what Professor Stanley already did. However, to me, maybe not only to me, however, it is her oeuvre as a theorist and a scholar that is and will remain directly accessible to each of us here, now and in the future. Professor Steady published 5 scholarly monographs and 5 edited volumes, as well as a number of UN publications. She also published over 30 peer-reviewed articles in journals, including Race, Gender, and Class, on whose editorial board she has served for many years, and also chapters in edited volumes. The subjects of these books again span the social realities that, in according to Dr. Steady's theory of humanistic feminism, must be transformed together as a connected whole. The 5 monographs include 3 books about women and women's power and empowerment in Sierra Leone. And I have the titles, but you've seen those on the PowerPoint, so I will not read those again. And also Women and Collective Action in Africa, Development, Democratization and Empowerment. Again, you see that very connected approach to how the progress of women and people in general have to be approached. Drawing on feminist and womanist theory, critical race theory, and social movement theory, among other areas, Professor Steady's work always adopts a clear methodology and carefully defined and grounded concepts. Concepts such as civil society, now very common, empowerment, collective identity, and one that I often cite in my classes, structured expendability. Some people are expendable, and that is not an accident. The condition that is inflicted on Black people globally and cross-culturally by those actors who perpetuate and benefit from their systematic underdevelopment and structural discrimination and subordination. The edited volumes include Women and Children First, Environment, Poverty and Sustainable Development, Black Women, Globalization and Economic Justice, Environmental Justice in the New Millennium, Race, Ethnicity and Human Rights, and of course the prize-winning volume of worldwide renown, now in its 3rd edition, The Black Woman Cross-Culturally. This last edition consists of 30 contributions in 4 areas already mentioned: Africa, the United States, the Caribbean, and South America, spans several centuries, and encompasses many fields and disciplines, including anthropology, architecture and urban planning, development studies, education, ethnomusicology, history, journalism, literature, psychological and cultural studies, public policy, and sociology. I will conclude my remarks with Professor Steady's innovative and transformative theorization of African feminism as humanistic feminism, most recently outlined in the 2011 edition of The Black Woman Cross-Culturally. And you'll see there will be a rhyme with the keynote speaker and also with earlier remarks on this panel. Professor Steady theorizes the humanistic feminism developed and practiced by African women as humanist, sociocentric, activist, composite, and inclusive feminism. I wish I had time to unpack each of these terms because they all actually carry deep meaning in her work. It operates within the framework in which sexism cannot be separated from racism, political foreign domination, economic underdevelopment, structural ecological expandability, authoritarianism, religious fundamentalisms, or large-scale political violence against civilians. While this concept is aware of and connects the local, national, international, and cross-cultural, it is rooted in African and Africana women's social and cultural understandings, context, and solidarities, which include the centrality of motherhood and child-rearing, the values of caring for others, including men, and sociocentric leadership for the benefit of society as a whole. Thus it is, as she puts it, transformative in human and social terms, rather than personal, individualistic, and sexist terms. So here I wanted to kind of include a little story about leadership and about motherhood. And I'll take you to Boston, and I'll take you very briefly to the Somali community. When it was very new in Boston, 1994, of course, the state collapsed in 1991. We had about 23 Wellesley students actually working with kids from this new immigrant community. And Charlotte was part of that early endeavor. And it was an amazing moment to witness Somalis in Boston, because they had never experienced blackness or Muslimness as negative. And they very quickly realized that they also had been influenced by racist stereotypes that they had about African Americans. And truly, it hit them. That also, those lies hit them as a wall, you know. So in any case, so there was immediately there was a Somali woman who established Somali Women and Children organization. It still exists as a resettlement of immigrants and refugees in Boston. And so I was meeting this person, and we were sitting with a group of women, and suddenly she says to me, she said, "London, listen, what is this tough leadership that these Americans are talking about all the time? Does it mean that we just really help others? Yeah, women, girls, but others succeed?" I said, yes. I said, well, then every African woman is a leader, she said. Yeah. And then very briefly, I will skip the second one, but just in my African history class, we were just reading an article last week. It's called Mamas in the Newsroom. And it is about rural, grassroots radio journalists who have raised in Eastern DRC, Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, the whole issue of sexual violence and war rape. And they have said, how come that the perpetrators are working around without shame while women victims feel ashamed to come forward? And the term mamas in the newsroom for some of my students was, wow, you know, why are they pushing these women into the domestic sphere? And of course, no higher praise than being a mama in the newsroom, as has been explained, I think, sufficiently. So I'll read my final remarks. Filomina, and I will continue the quote where I said that humanistic feminism is transformative in human and social terms rather than personal, individualistic, and sexist terms. She continues, it links theory to praxis and emphasizes activism. As a result, it has enabled Black women to develop survival skills, resistance and empowerment strategies, and to become resourceful on their own and through alliances with others, fighting against economic, political, and cultural oppression. It takes historical forces of domination, the international political economy, as well as gender hierarchies into account. They include the structural domination and oppression of both black men and women in Africa and the African diaspora as a result of transatlantic slavery, colonialism, patriarchy, neocolonialism, structural racism, racial discrimination, and corporate globalization. In this regard, ending the domination and oppression of black men is also on its agenda. End of quote. I don't think anybody could have said that better. The theorization of African feminism as humanistic feminism will always be associated with the name of Professor Steady. However, as important to those who know her is that she has also embodied African women's humanistic feminism as wife and mother, as teacher and mentor, as scholar, activist, practitioner, and leader, and as our colleague for more than 20 years here at Wellesley College. Thank you, Filomina.
Well, I want to start by saying what a tremendous privilege and honor for me to be here as part of this event. And I'm really grateful to be invited and be included among all my African sisters and in the presence of Professor Filomina Steady. I'm not going to say a lot that have already been said in terms of her importance as a scholar and practitioner, but I want to emphasize her importance in the field of women in international development, which has also been my field of work. But before I go on to talk about women in international development, like many others before me, I want to make some personal remarks and express my gratitude to her for her warmth, for her sisterhood, for her friendship, all these years. And in spite of her tremendous responsibilities and work, she has always been there for me. And like for many other people, written innumerable letters of recommendation and given endorsements. Mm-hmm. And you don't always find that, you know. Mm-hmm. And I will always be very, very grateful for that. Thank you. I first came to know of Professor Filomina Steady in the earliest years of my own teaching in Women in International Development, courses at Yale and later at Brandeis and Mount Holyoke. And when I started out while I was still doing my PhD thesis at Yale, and I was teaching the Women of Color section of the Introduction to Women's Studies, which was taught by Catherine McKinnon. And I was teaching the first Women of Color course, and there was no really literature on women of color. The term itself had not been coined. So I was just looking for material. And so when I began to come across the work of Filomina Steady, it was such a tremendous relief, and it was like finding a treasure trove. So I used Black Women Cross-Culturally as a text in my courses at these universities for many, many years. So later, when I actually came to meet her, it was so exciting to meet Filomina in person. And then on top of that, to have had the opportunity to work with her on projects and participate in some of her tremendous efforts, including a conference she organized here at Wellesley called Global Perspectives on the Black Woman, Race and Gender in the Age of Globalization. That was in 2001, but it just seems like yesterday, and some of us here in the audience were there, and it was a very, very exciting event. Professor Steady's work on women's leadership, as has been mentioned before, is very important because she conceptualizes leadership in a very different way from how it has been approached in Western feminism. So her work, Women's Leadership in West Africa and Environmental Justice in the New Millennium, really helped expand the WID field, the Women in International Development field, as well as the field of women of color studies. And her work, Globalization and Black Women, Globalization and Economic Justice, I feel very privileged to have been a part of that collection, because I think that it really helped expand our understanding of globalization from a very critical perspective, and also help put forward gender as an organizing principle of corporate globalization and women's victimization. Because I think oftentimes in the WID field, and particularly in mainstream literature, there has not been a critical understanding of globalization. We talk about integrating women into international development without asking what kind of development, what kind of globalization. And Filomina's work has been very important in asking those critical questions. So what I like to do in the few minutes I have is to try to talk about the future, because many of us have talked about where her work is coming from, where the field has been. But since I titled my talk, Women's Leadership in a Changing World, I like to pay a little bit more attention to how the world is changing and how Professor Filomina Steady's work can help both understand that world and maybe help move the trajectory in a positive direction. And in this regard, I also want to mention that the remarks that I'm making are also drawn from my own work, like my book, Women, Population and Global Crisis, as well as articles like More Than Mere Statistics and Victims of Development, which were actually the first reviews of women in international development that were published in the Women's Review of Books here at Wellesley College. So my own relationship to the work that's been done here, the very important work that has been done at Wellesley, goes back to my days at Brandeis, when we used to come here and be participants in the discussions at the Center for Women's Research, which was a very important center that helped launch the Women in International Development field. So, looking at what's happening today and where we are headed, I think we have to recognize that in some ways feminism has become mainstream. We hear so much about women's empowerment and women's leadership, but much of what is happening today is marketization of feminism by business and entertainment leaders. I mean, even Sheryl Sandberg and Beyonce come to mind. And they are actually promoting corporate globalization. And many people are sort of accepting it without questioning. And in the spirit of Filomina Steady's work and the work that's done at Wellesley, I think we have to take a much more critical look at what is passing as feminism and women's leadership today. Because that approach does not recognize how corporate-led economic policies and governing structures are actually undermining women's livelihoods and well-being, and how they are actually creating barriers to women's empowerment, and the empowerment particularly of ordinary women around the world. Policies which put corporate profit before the environment and people, and climate change that is stemming from these policies are undermining women's traditional roles in agriculture and women's ability to care for families and communities, including women's roles as mothers, that Filomina, and others have really discussed. Facile slogans such as "the future is female" and mainstream discourses do not take into account the brave new world of market and technological integration and domination that we are entering now. In a world where every aspect of production, reproduction, as well as consciousness is commoditized, and where a handful of megalithic corporations led by finance capital is increasingly controlling all of nature and people through artificial intelligence and biotechnology, we have to draw from the work of people like Filomina Steady and ask, what is the role that we as women can play in this brave new world? According to corporate sources, there will be more genetically engineered, lab-created forms of plant and animal life on Earth, more than those identified in nature in 50 years. Designer babies and human genetic engineering are already here. As you know, the first gene-edited children were born in China just last November. And technology is displacing people, and it is estimated that there will be more robots than humans in the workforce by 2030. So all the work that has been done by Professor Steady in questioning the dominant model of globalization and its destruction of the environment and humanity and the role of women in taking leadership are extremely pertinent to trying to understand where we are headed and trying to change that trajectory. Control of communications in the hands of a few tech corporations such as Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Alibaba, Baidu has to be looked at very seriously. Facebook has 2 billion users and influences not only what we buy, but how we vote. It also affects regime change and ethno-religious conflicts and violence around the world. Whether backed by private capital in the US or state in China, these tech companies pose severe threats to our privacy, freedom, and our experience of life as a species in nature. And when we look at what is actually happening, scientists and their corporate funders are predicting human beings becoming increasingly integrated with technology. And I'm going to jump a lot of things here about the brave new world that we are entering and ask some questions about what we as human beings can do, and especially as women. I'm going to skip some examples of leadership that is being taken by women in terms of calling for corporate accountability and workers' rights, like the draft treaty on transnational corporations and human rights within the UN, a place where, Professor Steady has played a very important role. Another is the call to stop illicit financial flows, particularly from Africa, where there are some 50 billion illicit financial outflows from Africa each year. And then women's groups are talking about using these illicit flows and turning them around for economic and social justice. These are women's organizations that are doing that. Another is the campaign against the digital trade rules in the World Trade Organization. Women's demand for having greater control over the technology corporations that are, ruling the world. So just to finish up, I would like to point out that, like Professor Filomina Steady, who comes from Sierra Leone, I also come from a country that has been torn, Sri Lanka, by terrible violence. And just look at what happened just a few days ago. But this is not just a tragedy for Sri Lanka or Sierra Leone. It is a global tragedy. It is happening all the time. it's Paris, it's Iraq, it's Afghanistan, it's the Philippines, it's Jakarta, it's Florida, it's California, it's Christchurch, it's Colombo, it's Negombo, it's Batticlaw, and the list goes on and on. We cannot see these as isolated incidents. You don't know where the next one is coming at. And that's why, rather than seeing different groups as all constituting terrorists or victims, we have to transcend that binary thinking that has been referred to earlier. And I think following Filomina's work, we have to see how this extreme form of globalization that is dominant in the world and the extreme form of ethno-religious fundamentalism of all stripes are interrelated, how they are connected, this extremism of the dominant system and extremism of the resistance. And that, I think, is where women come in to provide a different form of leadership and to really take our rightful place to change this trajectory so that there is actually a future for people and the planet. And so I want to conclude by saying I hope and I know that Professor Filomina Steady's work is not done. She is needed in the world. She's needed for us to continue this work. And I hope that we can further that work by developing more initiatives to connect women and development and peace. We need more work. We need more initiative. We need to come together. And Filomina has shown us the way. She's going to be continuing this work, and we need to, I mean, I'm not saying you should not take a break, but I think, that, you know, under her leadership and guidance, there is so much that needs to be done, and we have to pass this on to the younger generations, because most of us are now the older generation. So I want to conclude again by thanking Filomina for the opportunities given to me and so many others, and wishing her happiness and health and longevity and all success. Thank you.
My name is Daphne Nchiri, and I'm coming from Wayne State University in Detroit. After all what we've had this morning, I just don't know what I can add that's new. It's been a beautiful morning, and I am so delighted. I am so honored. I feel so empowered to be here this morning to share in this endeavor, celebrating the achievements, the work, the industry, the resourcefulness of another Sierra Leone woman from Sierra Leone. I have been sitting in my chair dancing all the way. You know what it means to connect with somebody as powerful as Mrs. Filomina Jones Steady? It's a beautiful thing. You know, I want to bring a different dimension to what we've been talking about. I want to add a couple of the personal things. How I identify with Filomina. I wasn't supposed to be here. About a few weeks ago, I saw an email from Achola Pala, who is a colleague of hers. And she sent out this email talking about a lecture by Filomina that's on YouTube. I took a look at it, and I took my notes. I'm doing all this wonderful note-taking. Patriarchal ideology, yes, this. Motherhood, and all the pride about this, that. So I took all my notes. And then, maybe about 10 days ago, I see another flyer, something like this, saying they're celebrating the retirement of Professor Filomina Steady. And I said, what? And I am not part of anything? I don't believe this. This is my country woman. And how can she do this? I don't care what she does, but I'm going to be there. Filomina and I went to the same high school. She was years ahead of me, but I did meet her in school. And you know, within the African context, you pay attention, obedience to the elder student. You know, you go in there, you're so cowardly, you're talking to her. And so I identify with her on several fronts. One, as a Creole woman, and I have to say something about it, because when I say I'm a Creole woman, you say Creole, people say, are you from Louisiana? No. I'm not talking about those kind of Louisiana Creoles, because, but Creole people are settlers. We are settler people. And I should say something about it, even though you might have read the book or might know something about it. But the Creoles, if you know anything about them, they think themselves above everybody else. If they know there was Europe, maybe they would never have thought we were the best in the world. She is keeping up with the image of the Creoles. The Creoles are repatriated slaves that came from the Caribbean, they came from Nova Scotia, and they came from England. They were freed slaves. And it started way back in the 1700s. I don't know how that happens, but 1700s, they're settling slaves in Freetown, and the slave trade is still going on. You analyze that. I always wonder, how is that? We went to the same school, and we also went same religion, and the Creoles were a very particular group. In fact, our school, if you want to know this, was founded in 1849. Wellesley was founded in 1875. So way before, everybody's been saying that African women had the vote, and because of the Creole settlement, Professor Filomina Steady, in terms of her work and in terms of her profile, clearly identifies with the history of the Creole people in Sierra Leone. She is Wellesley College too. I mean, the alma mater of Madeleine Albright and Mrs. Clinton. Filomina, what else? You've just done it. I mean, this is it. The rich and famous, whilst we are in Midwest Detroit. I'm coming from Detroit. You know what I mean? I mean, it was all that energy. Yeah, it was all that. I said, Wellesley? And she's leaving and she's not inviting me? I got to come from Detroit to here. I came to Michigan State, recruited after the 60 riots. Professors went all over the world looking for people to come back, and we were pre-colonial. So post-colonial. So we were done with colonialism, and so there was open access to African countries, which had been denied for a long time. Africans couldn't come to the United States because the education was not respected, and the British made it that way so that people didn't move from Freetown or Sierra Leone or English colonies to come to the United States. So fast forward, I came here in the 70s, recruited to go to Michigan State. And bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, I wanted to change the world. I had all this energy as a young Creole woman trying to do something. So I came to Michigan State, and the professor who recruited me was in linguistics. And he had liked my paper on language, and he said I should come and do linguistics. But I came to Michigan State, and I did my master's, and I thought that was it. Stratificational grammar, tag mimics, too technical. I have no access to people. I want to change the world. I want to do something with people. And so I left, and I went into adult education. And what would I find? I wanted to do something on literacy, adult literacy. I wanted to go back and make my country literate. I realized in a trip I took to another country that I found this guy that I liked, and we were all buying postcards to send home. And he stood there and looked at everybody, and we said, well, are you going to send a postcard home like everybody else? And he just looked and said, I don't have anybody to send in. Nobody in my family reads. All of a sudden, I had a new consciousness that you can look good and like that, but nobody in your family reads. So I wanted to do something with literacy. So it was on that mission that took me, when I went into adulthood, that I was asked to go to Switzerland to write proposals to promote women in Africa on labor. How do we make the women progress quickly so we can use them in the workforce? It was a wonderful opportunity. Adult literacy, if anybody's listening and is looking about a field in which to get into, adult literacy and gender, they tie in very well. You know why? Because illiteracy wears a woman's face. Around the world, illiteracy wears a woman's face. So here I was, thrown into Switzerland. I'd just been in the country 4 years and didn't know what it was about. And there I met a group called the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Women's International is a very well-endowed and powerful organization post-war, First World and Second War. And so they were too happy to have me as a champion. Oh, we found somebody black. We can use this black woman to go do all this stuff. We can do this, we can do that. It was that sent me, they prepared to send me to the International Women's Conference. Everybody's talked about the International Women's Decade, 1975 to 1995. I went to this conference, and let me just linger for a minute. That conference, I had just been in the country 4 years. Guess what? I went to this conference, 2000, maybe 5, I don't know. I mean, there are people everywhere. And there was the government conference, and then there was the non-governmental. I can't believe all these women typing this and that and that and this and this and that, writing newsletters. What? I can't believe it. I'd never seen this in Africa where I was growing up. And lo and behold, who was behind one of these conferences? That lady there. That lady there. That I had not seen in school for a long time. Dr. Filomina Steady. I said, and she was with the lady from Uganda. And I said, oh, is that right? He said, I waved at her, just scaringly, because that was my senior in school. You don't talk to your senior like that. You have to give her all the accolades and stuff. So that was my first contact with Filomina. And, okay, I only have 5 minutes. That's not fair. But anyway, I'll speed it up because a couple of things. Do you know that following that conference, I bought the book, and knowing that she had just done, I was able to be funded by the Women's International League on Peace and Freedom to do a book because of Filomina. We've used the book extensively, your book, cross-culturally, Black Women Cross-Culturally, and I want to move quickly to that because I have a couple of things. Well, anyway, the conference, the International Women's Health Conference, extended to Copenhagen again. And I met her again in Copenhagen. And again, she was part of the governmental conference, walking behind the scenes. You didn't see her, you just saw her quickly, and then she moved. And I want to fast forward because following the Copenhagen conference, I got a faculty position. All this, I was not a faculty. I was just a student, finishing my degree, and then finished that, and then I went to, I came back with all this body of knowledge and working on all these proposals, getting to know what the field was about, and it ended up with a position at Wayne State. I got a copy of a book that was published in 1981. I got later on at Wayne State, I was hired as the faculty. And if you went to school in the 70s, if you were female, there were so many opportunities for women. Everybody who was a woman had to get engaged in some kind of women's studies because there was money for it. Today, we don't have as much money for women's studies, but in the 70s and 80s, there was ample opportunities to do some stuff. So if you came into the university in my literacy studies, literacy interfaces with gender. So one of my job was to do that. And I landed up on the book, Black Women Cross-Culturally, and spent some time using that. And from that, I fast forward to the whole question of feminism, embracing that, understanding it from these conferences. And from there, we went on to another concept somebody was toying with called womanism from Alice Walker. And then from Alice Walker, it morphed into, well, not morphed, there was a derivative of womanism, Africana womanism. And of course, I'm looking at Layli right there because she has a book, The Womanist Reader, that I use in my class. Again, and Dr. Steady is critically quoted all through that book by Clenora Hudson Weems. I wrote the introduction to the book, and we both quoted you extensively. I want to even just share this one quote that I would like to share with you. This is one thing that I always give my students as a discussion. I teach online, and give them discussion questions. But cross-culturally, there are so many quotes. Now that I have 5 minutes, I'll read this at least, and then I'll say a few more things. Regardless of one's position, the implications of the feminist movement for the Black women are complex. Several factors set the Black women apart as having a different set of priorities. She is oppressed not simply because of her sex, but ostensibly because of her race, and for the majority, essentially because of their class. Women belong to different socioeconomic groups and do not represent a universal category. Because the majority of Black women are poor, and that's a critical thing, because when we look at Black women around the world, that is an element that we have to, because the majority of Black women are poor, there's likely to be some alienation from the middle class aspect of the women's movement, which perceives feminism as an attack on men rather than on a system which thrives on inequality. So when we move from this into Africana womanism, we are trying to buttress the whole concept of the circumstances surrounding Black women within the feminist movement. And in that case, Africana womanism becomes that ideology that explores those particular characteristics of Black women that feminism doesn't. Because Black women were, as Bell Hooks will say, we're on the periphery, and from the periphery, we're moving in. But I think we have to have derivatives. We're scholars. Scholars explore. Scholars have to find concept. They conceptualize. They bring new ideas. And so Africana womanism was, in this sense, creating another space where Black women can find the tools by which they can organize, by which they can theorize, by which they can historicize, by which they can do all the other things that we need to do. But Professor Filomina Steady, Saro woman, kusha, kusha, kusha. That's what we say in Freetown when we say kusha means welcome, kusha means you've done a good job, kusha means everything. So Dr. Filomina Jones, that was her first name. And you hear the names Jones, my name was Williams, another friend over there, we all wearing this is our kind of our outfit that we wear in the Creoles. Again, you see it's not a wrap long thing, it's a different type of stuff that came from the Caribbean. And, well, not from the Caribbean, we created our own style. But this is Creole attire that I'm wearing today. So you do us proud, you make us proud. I just feel that coming here, you couldn't have left me out. Just put it that way. You couldn't have left me out. I was gonna be here whether you liked it or not. So I'm happy that I'm here, and that as we look at the future, you can take a break, but at the same time, continue on this trajectory of making the kind of contributions that you've made and that you will continue to make, because I know, as everybody has said, you're not gonna take a rest, you're gonna continue to do the good thing.